Let's find out who are the Kurds. Contrary to ill-informed people, the Middle East is not just full of Arabs. The Middle East is a diverse region full of Arabs, Armenians, Persian, Turks, many more groups of people that would make this list too long. But very importantly for this video, the Kurdish people, also known as the Kurds. To the shock of a Turkish nationalist, Kurds are not Turks, they are not mountain Turks. And to the shock of just ill-informed people, Kurds are not Arabs. For your own safety, viewer, I would highly recommend that you don't mix that up, because in some places, those are fighting words. Now, Kurds are their own group of people. They have their own language, culture, history, they had their own states, leaders, and so on and so forth. Fun fact, Saladin, aka Salahuddin, who led the Muslims in the Third Crusade that retook Jerusalem and later established the Ayyubi dynasty, was a Kurd. So Kurds also have a long and influential history in the Middle East. Now please excuse me as I kinda have to skip over all of that, because this video is going to be aimed mostly about the modern Kurdish struggle and not the encompassing history of the Kurdish people. So our story will start in about the late 1800s. In about the same time frame, the Ottoman and Persian empires would begin to expand their borders or exert control within their borders. These Kurdish states would find themselves being pitted against the Ottomans, the Persians, or just other Kurdish states. As some of these Kurdish states, like the Ottoman Empire, and some of these Kurdish states like the Persian Empire, and some of these Kurdish states just disliked the Kurdish state next to them and wanted to use the Ottomans or the Persians or whoever would ally with them to become a new fighting force they could fight with. I think it's very important to establish now in the video that Kurds, like many groups, are not a monolithic group. One thing I hear people say is the Kurds are doing XYZ, but the Kurds are not a monolithic group. They have diverse inner struggles and disagreements. Now, sorry to the person who really likes this section, I'm going to, well, do a very huge oversimplification of this. Now, even though these Kurdish states were fighting for or against the Ottomans or the Persians or, things of that sort, by the end of, this struggle between the Ottomans and the Persians and the Kurdish states, these Kurds, no matter what sides they were on or supporting or fighting against, would now find themselves within the borders of the Ottoman Empire or the Persian Empire. This isn't to say that Ottoman and the Persian authorities, which I will be calling the Qajars because the Qajars were in charge during this time, found themselves without Kurdish resistance. We could especially see this after the 100th billionth millionth Russo-Turkish War. In this case, the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1888. And in the aftermath of this war, eastern parts of the Ottoman Empire would be in shambles, would be destroyed because, they just had this huge war. On top of that, the Ottoman Empire would then have to sign the Treaty of Berlin in 1878. And within this treaty, it would talk about giving Armenians and Christians within the Ottoman Empire more rights. This would then lead to a fear among the Kurdish population of a Armenian state being formed over Kurdish territory, and this would help inspire the Sheikh Ubaydullah rebellion. The popular Kurdish Naqshbandiya Sheikh Ubaydullah would spark a Kurdish rebellion against the Ottomans and later on the Qajars from 1879 to 1800. Sheikh Ubaydullah's popular support and later on support for his rebellion was very high with many Kurdish villages and tribal leaders, as Sheikh Ubaydullah came from the powerful... Sorry to Kurdish and Turkish viewers, I'm going to be butchering your names a lot. Now, Sheikh Ubaydullah came from the powerful Simdian Naqshband family, which I don't know if the family is still popular now, but I know at the time they had a lot of popular support, as Sheikh Ubaydullah's family was very influential in the Sunni Sufi order called the Naqshbandi or Naqshbandiya. And while this rebellion was pretty short, the lasting legacy of Sheikh Ubaydullah's rebellion is that it was the first Kurdish nationalist type uprising that would inspire other uprisings down the line and would of course inspire other uprisings down the line. You kind of see what I'm getting at. You see, while other Kurdish rebellions were aimed at maybe a certain tribe or leader, Sheikh Ubaydullah's rebellion was aimed at uniting Kurds both in Ottoman and Qajar territories into a state, for Kurdish people, also known as a land of the Kurds. Now, for those that don't know, the Ottoman Empire would join the Central Powers in World War I, and the Ottoman Empire kind of failed in World War I, to where we will be moving into the Interwar Period. It's the end of World War I, and if we're being very brutally honest, about the end of the Ottoman Empire. The Middle East is now divided and influenced by many European states and their following mandates. From southern Hijaz all the way to Istanbul, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire would affect everyone in the Middle East. Arabs, Turks, Armenians, and Kurds would find themselves being placed into a new nation state, leading a rebellion to create their own states, or were now placed within European mandates. During this time, you'd see the creation of states like Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. Now, for this Middle Eastern region part here, the creation of these new states and zones would be called the Sykes-Picot Agreement between the French and the British. The Anatolian region would also have its own form of division via the treaties of Sèvres. I hope I didn't butcher that. And the Treaty of Sèvres looked like this. This treaty would see Anatolia divided up between European nations. You'd also see the creation of a Armenia, and you also see a proposed creation for a Kurdistan. Now, many folks in the Anatolia region did not like the new division of land and would kick off the Turkish War of Liberation, aka the Turkish War of Independence, led by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. Turks weren't the only people to fight against the treaties of Sèvres and the European powers. Kurds were one of the groups that fought side by side with Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, as during the War of Independence, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk would rally many Muslims, including the Kurds, to fight against what they viewed as non-Muslim European nations, and they also were fighting to preserve the Caliphate, which was ruled by the Ottomans. Now, this isn't to say that Kurds were all politically united, because they weren't a monolithic group, especially in this case, as there wasn't one united, political scene Kurds could really go to. And during this time, you would see Kurds fight against Mustafa Kemal Ataturk and other Kurdish tribes for the idea of this new Kurdistan. During this time, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk would promise Kurds local autonomy, and that Kurdish inhabited areas would rule themselves, autonomously, and that the Assembly of Turkey would be composed of both Turks and Kurds. Let's just say that almost none of that happened. Following, the end of the Turkish War of Liberation and the establishment of the Republic of Turkey, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk would abolish the Ottoman Caliphate in 1924. Turkey would also begin to enact aggressive secular policies that would alienate many religious Turks and Kurds that fought to, save and preserve the Caliphate. We would also see Mustafa Kemal Ataturk become more concerned about Iraqi Kurds, where the possibility of a British-backed Kurdish state was being considered and was a possibility, and Mustafa Kemal Ataturk was afraid that this idea could spread into southern Turkey. And very importantly, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk was like a hardcore Turkish nationalist, and Turkey for him was like a Turkish nationalist state. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk would unite Turkey under the idea of being Turkish. Along with him pushing his ideas of Kemalism, Turkey would then begin to single out Kurds as being a huge issue, for Turkey. During this time, you would see Kurdish cultural type things and their language be banned, because in Mustafa Kemal's eyes, like I said, Turkey was being built around the idea of being a Turk. If you were a different group, you had to work around that then. No surprise here, but this would lead to a souring between the Turkish Republic and the Kurdish, people relationship. Turkey's only rising anti-Kurdish and anti-religious sentiments would only continue to alienate the Kurdish population, and you would see many Kurdish rebellions be sparked during the interwar period. You would see the Sheikh rebellion, which called for a jihad against Turkey due to its anti-Kurdish and anti-religious policies. This revolt would fail. You'd also see the Mount Ararat revolt kick off from the Syrian-based Kurdish nationalist group called the Koyban or the Soyban. This revolt would also fail. One of the last major Kurdish rebellions to happen in Turkey during this time happened in 1935, called the Dermsir Rebellion. Now, Dermsir had always been a region of resistance against Turkey, and the Dermsir Rebellion was like the final straw for Turkey. The Dermsir Rebellion is also known as the Dermsir Massacre and Genocide, as thousands of Kurds were killed by the Turkish military, with Turkey using chemical weapons on the Kurdish population. But I mean Turkey's first female military pilot and world's first combat pilot, Sabiha Gökçen, would participate in these operations, so progress. Instead of boring men committing ethnic cleansing, women can do it too. And also during this time, Turkey would begin to displace Kurds in the hope of making them a minority in predominantly Kurdish areas, while also giving land to Turks who moved in to take, this Kurdish land. Many Turkish Kurds would then flee into Syria as refugees to escape the rebellions and the war and the new policies enacted on them. During this time, France would then give citizenship to these Turkish Kurds who fled into northeast Syria, while Turkey would place a state of emergency over southern Turkey, and would ban journalists from coming into southern Turkey, as Turkey didn't want the bad PR and press of what they were doing to the Kurds. Now we're going to move to the country to the east, now off to Iran, which has gone through a military coup in 1921 but was still suffering from the Simco-Shikak revolt that had broken out previously in 1918 that fought against Ottoman and Persian forces, and including the newly, formed Reza Shah government of Iran, aka Persia. I think it's very important to state that the Simco-Shikak revolt would also see a massacring of Assyrians, which would then in return cause Assyrian militias to then attack Simco-Shikak's revolt. This revolt would end up failing, but Simco would then try to, inspire another revolt, but that one also failed, where he was then killed in an ambush. Side note here, I'm going to be calling Persia Iran, even though I know Iran, the name came later down the line. We all know what I'm talking about. So the new Iranian government under, Reza Shah was trying to centralize the, government. They were trying to work on modernizing the country and westernize the country, and would begin to work on implementing Iranian nationalism, which tended to revolve around Shiite Persian culture for the most part. Other cultures and groups in Iran, and specifically speaking, for this case, the Kurds, within Iran would find themselves being placed at odds with the new government, just like in Turkey, as they're trying to, centralize the government, and they were trying to work the country around a new nationalist idea. As the interwar period went on, Iran would suffer more Kurdish revolts throughout the 20s, as Kurdish culture was banned, Kurdish villages were destroyed, the new Iranian government would try to inspire inner Kurdish conflicts between the tribes. You would see displacements of Kurds, and religious practices were banned that alienated the religious Kurds. Now we're going to move off to Syria, where France was ruling over Syria. France would also begin to supply minority groups in Syria in the hopes of using them as an anchor against the majority Sunni Muslim population. Even with French attempts at placing the Sunni majority at a disadvantage in Syria, Kurdish populated areas in Syria, who tend to mostly be Sunni Muslim, would become a hub of pro-Kurdish sentiment and pro-Kurdish nationalistic sentiment. And France would actually supply and wanted to use these Kurdish nationalist sentiment as another layer of a divide and conquer tactic in Syria, along with using Kurds as a possible proxy against Turkey. During the 30s, Syria would become a hub of Kurdish culture. Syrian Kurds would attempt to create a united language. For those that don't know, their Kurdish language has its own variants, country to country, group to group, people to people. Syrian Kurds would have the luxury of having a more stable and diverse political sphere, such as having communists, anti-communists, and of course their nationalistic aspirations. And on top of that, Syria was, we'll say, less influenced by inner Kurdish tribal politics and other Kurdish conservative nationalist uprisings and groups at the time. This was of course more stable and diverse compared to places like Turkey and Iran. Now we're going to go off to Iraq, where the British ruled over Iraq, ruling over both the Arab and the Kurdish population there. And while both Iraq and the British would recognize Kurds as a minority, would allow Kurds to have their own language and culture, and things of that sort, many Kurds in Iraq would distrust the Iraqi and British rule. Kurds would feel disenfranchised due to the way how the British and the Iraqi governments would execute their policies towards Kurds. We can't forget Kurds in other nations were being oppressed, they were leading armed revolts, or they were being set up to become some form of proxy. In northern Iraq, you would see Sheikh Mahmoud Barzani lead a revolt against Iraq and British rule that failed, and he was exiled. But he would then return, where he then led another revolt, because a revolution never dies, creating the Kingdom of Kurdistan in 1922. This revolt also failed, and Kurds within Iraq would now find themselves as Kurds within Iraq. And as the British prepared to later withdraw from Iraq and give it its independence, in 1932, many Iraqi Kurds would have a growing concern about what this new Arab government was planning for them. Kurds would first protest, trying to have the British stay, but when the British left, you would see Kurdish uprisings break out against Iraqi authorities, and the Iraqi government would have to crush these revolts, but also during the process would attack Kurdish villages and the population with British support. Now for those that didn't realize, I said it was the 30s, and for those that don't know, during the 30s you would see the rise of fascism and things of that sort, and that would kick off World War II, which is my segue into the next chapter. It's World War II, and the world is gripped in conflict. In the Middle East, for the most part, and compared to Europe and places like China, was pretty stable. Now during World War II, you would see Iranian Kurds, begin to organize, and then you would see the Hammar-Rashid revolt in 1941, lasting until 1944 against the Iranian government. And practically during the same time span, Allied powers would invade Iran in 1941, establishing zones of occupations within Iran. And in this case, very importantly, northern Iran would fall under the control of the Soviet Union. Now the Soviets were supportive of Kurdish separatism, or at the very least, just dealt with it. During this time, Iraqi Kurds would then move into Iran to fight side by side with Iranian Kurds, where the Iranian and Iraqi Kurdish groups would then form the Kurdish Independence Party of Iran. The KIPD would then end up forming the Mahabad Republic in Soviet-occupied northern Iran. And the Soviets didn't mind this, as they didn't want to fight the local population of northern Iran and then in the process lose access to parts of northern Iran and its resources. If anything, the Soviets actually helped encourage the creation of the Mahabad Republic. The Mahabad Republic would face support from, Iraqi Kurds, the Soviet Union, and the Iranian Azeri state that was also formed in northern Iran during this time. But funny enough, wasn't heard of in places within Turkey or Syria, as information just didn't spread that fast. During this time, you'd also see internal conflicts over tribal tension happen within the Mahabad Republic, and you'd also see a growing distrust of the Soviets' intentions for the Republic and the external dread of an Iranian invasion into the Republic. Following the end of World War II, the Soviets would have to leave northern Iran, whether or not they wanted to. The ensuing Soviet withdrawal from northern Iran would leave the Mahabad Republic to practically fend for itself. The US and British-backed Iranian government would then move into northern Iran, ending the Mahabad Republic. Purges would then begin against the Kurdish population, with the Iranian government looking for collaborators, government workers, or fighters for the Mahabad Republic. During this time, you'd see mass killings and destructions of Kurdish villages in Iran. Even with the fall of the Mahabad Republic and a constant flow of government purges, Kurdish dreams of independence, or autonomy at the very least, wouldn't end, and you'd see a new Kurdish group called the Kurdish Democratic Party, called the KDP, formed in 1946. This was created by Kurdish intellectuals including Mustafa Barzani. Following Turkey's first election in 1950, you would also finally see the state of emergency placed over southern Turkey end, and the Kurdish people were allowed more leeway than before. Kurds were now allowed to run in government, but only if they viewed themselves as Turks, along with the Kurdish language being allowed to be used, but only in private. Though the bar was so low for giving Kurds rights in Turkey, the only thing the bar could do was go up. Kurds in Turkey would also see forms of integration with the Turkish population, as high-class Kurdish families and the Kurdish youth would then move to major Turkish cities or move into European universities. And you had many reasons for why the Kurdish youth and these, higher-class Kurdish families were moving into these cities or into Europe. For some, it was college. For some, it was just trying to find a new life. In some cases, their parents were displaced and now they lived there. And for other people, it was just there for work. During this time, many of the Kurdish youth would then be exposed to a new political sphere. During this time, we can't forget that anti-colonial sentiment was high in the air during the 50s and 60s. The Turkish Kurdish youth would also begin to dibble-dabble into Marxist and Marxist-Leninist thoughts and other leftist groups, especially when they went to these major Turkish cities and into these European colleges. The Turkish youth would also begin to see a rekindling of pro-Kurdish sentiment and a new spark of, leftist sentiment. But also during this time, you'd see the rise of anti-Kurdish sentiment among the Turkish far right. In 1960, you would see a Turkish military coup kick off. Then Kurds would once again find themselves being placed at odds with Turkey due to the new Turkish military government. Now we're gonna go down south into Syria, where funny enough the Kurdish population was at the time supportive of Arab nationalism, as it was, anti-French colonialism, as it was open and supportive to, Kurds. Heck, some of Syria's leaders, following French withdrawal and many military coups, would have Kurdish descent. The founder of the Syrian Communist Party also had Kurdish descent. So Kurds also had a very important role in Syrian history. This isn't me saying that Kurds became, Arab nationalists or hardcore Baathists, But I'm trying to say that Syrian Kurds found themselves at a unique crossroads. Due to the stability they had compared to like other Kurds within Turkey or Iran, Syrian Kurds within their own communities would find themselves being stuck between Kurdish nationalist ideas and communist ideas, along with Arab nationalists being somewhat supportive towards them. Syrian Kurds would also be some of the earlier supporters of the Syrian Communist Party, and Arab nationalists at the time were more open to, Kurdish people being in the political sphere much more. But as time went on and you'd see the rise of, different viewpoints of Arab nationalism, along with the formation and later on failure of the United Arab Republic, and you would also see the 1963 Ba'athist military coup that would place, the Syrian Ba'athist Party into power and create the Syrian Arab Republic. Syrian Kurds, especially after this military coup, would find themselves being excluded from Syria and its political sphere. Syria would now begin to frame itself as an Arab republic. Syrian Kurds would also find themselves being excluded from the Syrian Communist Party. They would also just find themselves being excluded from Syria and of course its political sphere. During this time, Syrian Kurds would also be stripped of their citizenship. Like I said earlier in the video, many Turkish Kurds would flee into Syria during the whole interwar period. For many Syrian Kurds themselves, maybe their parents or their grandparents were refugees that fled Turkey during the interwar period and all those Kurdish rebellions. They were given citizenship through the French, and the new Syrian Arab government viewed that as enough justification to strip these Kurds of their citizenship. Syrian Kurds were then seen as a foreign, backwards, and at times non-existent people by the new Syrian government. Arabization attempts would also begin against the Kurdish population, especially at the Syrian, Iraqi, and Turkish borders, with the plan of making an Arab belt. And while this settlement plan idea did fail, the Arab settlers that were brought there were allowed to keep their land that they had. Now we're going to go off to Iraq, where following the Iraqi Revolution of 1958, you would see an initial positive relationship between the KDP and the new Qassam Iraqi government, as the Iraqi government wanted allies in a growing power struggle within Iraq. Now I'm going to cut this short and just put it very bluntly. The KDP and the new Iraqi Qassam government relationship would sour, as the Iraqi government would feel that the KDP and Mustafa Barzani were becoming more bold towards the government, while Kurdish groups would feel that the Iraqi government was trying to stifle the Kurdish population and empower the Arab population of Iraq. This, growing distrust and souring of relationships would lead to the first Kurdish-Iraqi war, where you would see the formation of folks like the Kurdish Peshmerga. During this time, the Iraqi government would also begin to be supplied by the Americans and the British. This isn't to say that Kurdish groups did not get their own foreign support. Iran would supply these Kurdish groups, which is kind of weird because Iran was also dealing with its own Kurdish separatist issues, but politics is very layered, and for the Iranian government, they wanted to use these Iraqi Kurdish groups as a way to get a one-up on Iraq, because Iran and Iraq both disliked each other and had border disputes, especially around the Shat el-Arab region. Now, the Iraqi government would have a good amount of government changes and coups during this time of the war. But even with every new coup in government, they would continue their fight against these Kurdish groups, and the Kurdish-Iraqi war would only continue. On the Kurdish side of the war, the KDP would begin to see internal splits. This split would only continue between Barzani against Ibrahim Ahmed and Jalal al-Talabani, where Ibrahim Ahmed and Jalal al-Talabani would then lose the struggle to Barzani. Now, to give some detail about the inner KDP split, this split would happen between KDP members over the issue of autonomy for Kurds within Iraq. This split was also layered within the group because the more pro-Mustafa Barzani factions tended to be more traditional and more conservative, while the Ibrahim Ahmed and Jalal al-Talabani factions tended to be more leftist. This of course would only intensify the KDP split. The first Iraqi-Kurdish war would finally come to the end when another Iraqi Ba'athist government was, placed into power, and you see the creation of the Iraqi-Kurdish Autonomy Agreement of 1970, where Iraqi Kurds were allowed to speak their own language, participate in the government, and importantly, have an autonomous region formed, with the autonomous region going to be determined by a consensus of the Kurdish majorities over the span of 4 years. Now, during this war, and also during the 4 years of this consensus, you would see an increase of Arabization, especially in the oil-rich regions of Kirkuk and Kanaki. During this time, you would see disputes between the Iraqi government and the KDP over the right for Kurds to return to areas that they were displaced from or where Arabs now ruled. The KDP would begin to view this as the Iraqi government stepping back from its initial peace deal, and the Iraqi government would see this as the KDP trying to grab more land and be more bold towards them. When asked to accept the autonomous region, Mustafa Barzani would reject this request, and you would see the second Kurdish-Iraqi war kick off, starting in 1974, where the new Iraqi offensive into KDP territory would push back Kurdish rebels and cause Iran to supply the KDP. Foreign support for the KDP would halt in 1975 though, following the Algiers Accord, where Iran would stop supplying the KDP, where in return, Iraq and Iran would solve the border disputes between each other and avoid a war over the Shat el Arab region. You see, the Algiers Accord clearly worked out for everybody in the end. Now, with no foreign support, the KDP would fall to Iraqi forces and would begin to flee into Kurdish areas within Iran. Northern Iraq would then see an insurgency against the Iraqi government, and later on, Arabization attempts would continue within Iraq. Kurdish villages would be destroyed by the Iraqi army under Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr and later on under Saddam Hussein. Now remember that KDP split I talked about earlier between Barzani and Ibrahim Ahmed and Jalal al-Talabani? Well, Jalal al-Talabani and Ibrahim Ahmed and other left-leaning Kurds would end up forming the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, also known as the PUK, in 1975 in the city of Damascus. Now, the PUK told the KDP to go puck itself, as the relationship would dissolve into open combat between those two groups in 1976. In about the same time frame, Mustafa Barzani would quit the KDP leadership as he would have to go to the US because he was suffering from lung cancer, where he then passed away in 1979. The KDP would then be led by his son Masoud and Idris Barzani. And following the death of Mustafa Barzani, Iraqi Kurdistan would then see a power vacuum, with the newly formed PUK trying to take land and more support from the KDP. You know what else happened in 1979? Too many things happened in 1979, including the Iranian Revolution, where Kurds would participate in the rebellion against the Shah, as no one liked the Shah except people on Reddit, but that's a completely different discussion that some of you are not ready for. And following the fall of the Shah and the rise of the Islamic Republic of Iran, Kurdish groups would once again find themselves at odds with the new Iranian government, as the new Iranian government wanted to centralize everything. During this time, you would see the 1979 Kurdish uprising, where leftist Iranian groups, Kurdish groups, the PUK, and Kurdish leftist groups would fight against the Islamic Republic of Iran, where they were crushed by the newly formed Iranian government. After that, Kurdish groups would then lead an insurgency against the Iranian government until today. In the following year, 1980, the Iran-Iraq War would kick off, and Iraqi Kurdish groups, like the PUK and KDP, would find themselves fighting side by side with the newly formed Islamic Republic of Iran against Saddam Hussein. They would help Iranian forces take land in northern Iraq, and also help themselves take land in northern Iraq. During this time, Iran would also supply and fund and train these Kurdish groups, which is pretty layered because Iran just put down their own Kurdish groups in Iran, and Iraqi Kurdish troops were taking guns and ammo from the government that just put down a Kurdish revolt. Let's just say things are very layered right now, okay? Now, the Iran-Iraq War would see Saddam Hussein begin the El Anfal campaign, which officially was aimed at quelling Kurdish rebels, but in reality was just the Iraqi government attacking, gassing, looting, creating concentration camps and displacing the Iraqi Kurdish population, with it even earning the name the El Anfal genocide. Now, during the El Anfal operations and genocide, you would see the Iraqi government gas the city of Halabja with the properly named Halabja chemical attack and the more properly named Halabja massacre. Now, this is just one example, but I think it really shows how brutal the Iraqi government under Saddam Hussein was towards the Kurds. Now, as the Iran-Iraq War began to enter its final stages, where you had, a complete stalemate between Iranian and Iraqi forces, with Iranian and Iraqi forces entering peace talks, and Iraqi forces being shifted from the Iranian front to the Kurdish front, Kurdish resistance would begin to fall under more scrutiny from the Iraqi army, which was backed by the US, China, Gulf states, and to be frank, many governments within the world. Iraq would begin to turn its newly acquired weapons, tanks, and whatever you could think of on the Kurdish groups in Iraq. Kurdish resistance would then begin to fall, and Kurdish groups, and later on the Kurdish population, would begin to flee to neighboring countries, causing a refugee crisis. During the Iran-Iraq War, thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Kurdish civilians would be killed or displaced or face some form of persecution from the Iraqi government during this time. The Iraqi government would then clamp down on the Kurdish population in the hopes of preventing any more Kurdish uprisings. And this is where I'm going to leave the video for now, where you can stay tuned for part 2. And to give you guys a little heads up on what part 2 will be about, I bought this book that goes into very deep, excruciating details about the PKK-Turkish conflict. So part 2 will be very heavily influenced by the PKK-Turkish conflict. Sorry to anyone who was interested in anything but that. Stay tuned for part 2, which will come out when it's done.